Ranking every Mario Kart 8 Deluxe booster course pass track. I'm ranking just the BCP tracks because I really can't be bothered to rank all 96 tracks in this game. Also, this ranking will be structured more like my THX trailer ranking on my main channel, rather than the Sonic game ranking I made last month, since I honestly prefer this format. But with that out of the way, let's get into the ranking, starting with the only F tier course in this entire ranking, number 48, 3DS Toad Circuit. Wow, who could have seen this one coming? What is there even to say about Toad Circuit? The layout is boring, the visuals are some of the worst in the entire game, and of all the Mario Kart 7 tracks in total they could have brought to 8, why this one? We could have something like Shy Guy Bazaar, which is also a Mushroom Cup track in 7, so it would have fit perfectly in Wave 1. But no, we got Toad Circuit instead. Literally the only interesting things in this track are the giant toad balloons, the glider ramp that appears in lap 2, and a couple shortcuts near the end. Oh, and the music's pretty good too, I guess. But these things aren't enough to save this track from being dead last in this ranking. Moving on from the F tier, we now have the D tier tracks, which are better than Toad Circuit, but not by much. Number 47, Sky High Sunday. I remember being so excited for this track when it was revealed. The first new track since 2015? This is going to be so cool, and it's an oval. But somehow that isn't even this track's biggest problem. The problem is that this track just feels off. The fact that the entire track is anti-gravity, which was absolutely only added because people complained there wasn't any in Wave 1, makes it so every jump just feels floaty for literally no reason. Oh, and there's one jump where you literally cannot see ahead of you, meaning you're essentially making a leap of faith. But the worst part of the track is these railings at the beginning, which not only can you just clip through, but they also act as spin boosts? Why? What about these railings look like they could give you boosts? Honestly, if it wasn't for the decent visuals and music, this track would probably be dead last. Number 46, SNES Mario Circuit 3. The track that nobody was asking for, and yet here it is. While this track is visually worse than the previous tracks, I do think that the layout is interesting enough for me to consider it to be better than those. But other than that, I really can't think of anything else to say. There's like one shortcut at the end, which is admittedly somewhat satisfying to pull off. And the music is barely remixed at all, sounding a lot like 7's rendition of SNES Rainbow Road. At the very least, the track is quite fun at 200cc. But really, what was I expecting? I mean, how do you make a SNES track interesting? Number 45, GBA Sunset Wilds. The GBA remakes and the BCP are a pretty mixed bag. Some are pretty decent, but some just ruin what made the original so good. And Sunset Wilds definitely falls into the latter. So when you think of Sunset Wilds, what's the first thing you think of? The sun setting gradually every lap, right? Well, guess what? This version of the track removes that feature entirely. Yep, that's right, the one defining feature of this track is completely gone. I get why they couldn't include it, Mario Kart 8's engine wouldn't be able to support it. But at that point, why even add this track at all? If they really wanted to include a GBA desert track, they could have just chosen Yoshi Desert, which already has a pretty good remake in tour. Not only is this track's main gimmick gone, but the layout is significantly simpler as well, and the track overall is just kind of flat and boring. However, I do still like the theming, and the music is really good, and singing Shy Guys are always cool. Number 44, GBA Sky Garden. As with Sunset Wilds, this track was pretty butchered overall. However, I think this track turned out slightly better as the layout, while very simplified compared to the original, is more interesting and less flat. The addition of a giant mushroom along with a leaf shortcut is a nice touch. However, my biggest issue with this track is the visuals. This track looks less like Sky Garden and more like a discount Cloudtop Cruise. The beautiful turquoise cobbled road was replaced with a pretty ugly orange stone road and yellow off-road sections. It just doesn't look great. But speaking of great, the remix here is one of my favourites in the entire DLC. It just sounds so magical and is honestly a little too good for this track. Number 43, Tour Tokyo Blur. The first of many real-world city tracks in this ranking. I feel like most people don't really like the city tracks, but I personally find them to be quite fun. I think it might just be the novelty of driving through real locations that makes it so the fact that some of these tracks aren't super interesting doesn't bother me much. However, I do have a limit when it comes to this, and unfortunately Tokyo Blur goes past that limit. This track is just so boring. While the gimmick of the layout changing each lap is cool, the layout of this track simply isn't interesting enough for this to really improve its ranking. You literally spend the entire track driving on a boring grey road with very few obstacles. The final lap is especially guilty of this. At least it ends with a sort of cool glide over the bridge. Visually, this track is also much weaker than the other cities. Legit, the only thing I can remember from this track is the Rainbow Bridge. Even the music is kind of forgettable, being based on Toad Circuit's music for some reason. And now we're on to the C-tier tracks, which are tracks that are not great, but not terrible. They're just kind of okay. Number 42, Tour Paris Promenade, the track that started the entire DLC. For the first city track in the game, I think this track does a decent job introducing players to the concept of changing laps. However, compared to the other city tracks we've gotten since, this one feels very basic in comparison. This is mainly because, unlike most city tracks, this track only changes on lap 3, rather than every lap being unique. That being said, I do like how the final lap makes you go in reverse, and you can even run into other players going in the opposite direction if they're far enough behind. While this isn't an original concept, Luigi Circuit and Double Dash already did this, it's still really cool that this can happen. I also really like the atmosphere of this track. It's so calm and cozy, which is definitely helped by the very pleasant sounding music. Number 41, Tour New York Minute. Yet another city track. This one was actually the first to be made for Mario Kart Tour. I actually remember playing it when Tour first released. I uninstalled the game not too long after. That's nothing against this track though. I mean, I'm still not a huge fan of it, hence why it's number 41, but it's an okay track. My main problem with it is that the first two laps, while technically different, just feel very similar and not super interesting. There's some Goombas to avoid and some sharp turns, but that's about it. The third lap's pretty decent though. You drive through 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and then a car park, which is kinda cool I guess. One thing I do quite like about this track is how vibrant it is, with all the bright lights and advertisements on all the buildings, and the music perfectly fits the nighttime aesthetic. Number 40, Tour London Loop. A track based on not only a city from my country, but also the only city in this DLC that I've actually been to in real life. I must admit, it was pretty cool seeing all these landmarks in this track and thinking, I've seen this. But as for the track itself, it's a little bit on the plain side. The layout itself is quite intricate and each lap at least feels somewhat distinct. It's just that there isn't much to this track other than just driving on roads. The only obstacles in this track are a few chain chomps that break free on the final lap, which I do like. The visuals also aren't too great, but that's less so this track's fault, more so that London isn't a super visually appealing place to begin with. The music, however, is awesome, almost sounding like something straight out of a Sonic game. I don't think it fits London super well though. Number 39, DS Mario Circuit. This was probably one of the biggest surprises in the whole BCP. Of all the DS tracks they could have added, I don't think anyone was expecting Mario Circuit to be one of them. I don't think most people were happy with this choice either. Now I, on the other hand, have a confession to make. I've never played Mario Kart DS, so this track, like most of the city tracks, was completely new to me. And after playing it for the first time, it's fine. It's probably the best Mario Circuit in the game, which is kinda sad considering this is only number 39 and there's still 4 other Mario Circuits in this game. Oh well. I do like some of the changes they made to this version, such as turning one section into a forest area, complete with a wiggler that walks on the track in lap 3. I also like how the music retains the feel of the original while still sounding modern. But yeah, I still wish they chose something like Airship Fortress instead of this. Number 38, 3DS Alpine Pass. Yes, Alpine Pass. You Americans can keep your Rock Mountain. We in Europe have the superior name, although both names do kinda suck. As for the track itself, it's pretty forgettable. The big glider section near the beginning is really cool, and the mountain climb at the end is alright too. But this track is just so boring visually. Not only does it use the vastly inferior Tour aesthetic, other than the big pipes everywhere, this track just has the most generic mountain theme possible. This track isn't bad, but it's just forgettable honestly. Number 37, Wii Daisy Circuit. I was very surprised to see this track returning, and so late in the BCP as well. Honestly, I kinda wish this track wasn't included, considering we already have a lot of Wii tracks in this DLC and we could have had Piranha Plant Pipeline instead, which is now just stuck in Tour. But there's no point getting worked up about that now, let's just talk about the track itself. This is definitely one of the better circuit tracks in the series, which isn't saying a whole lot, but I find this track to be somewhat fun. I like the addition of a glider ramp after the stair shortcut near the beginning, letting you fly past the statues, similar to DS Peach Gardens. Also, I'm not sure if it's just me, but I vastly prefer how the sky looks in this version. Yeah, the original was more eye-catching, but not in a good way in my opinion. The new sky and just the lighting in this track overall looks absolutely gorgeous, and the music perfectly complements the sunset aesthetic. However, I don't like how the paved road is now orange. I just prefer how it looked more originally. The track layout itself also isn't super interesting, but it's a circuit track, so I suppose that's expected. But the best part of this track is that it confirms Luigi and Daisy are a thing. Number 36, Merry Mountain. I'm surprised it took this long to get a Christmas themed track, but hey, we finally got one and it's not too bad. The theming and the visuals definitely carry this track as the layout is pretty simple and gets kind of boring towards the end. You start in this town area which has this gorgeous red and green road, as well as giant Christmas decorations. Then a train passes by and you can choose to drive on the train tracks. This is all really cool, but unfortunately the actual mountain part of this track is pretty disappointing. While the giant presents look cool, there's nothing really to this part of the track aside from a half pipe and a gliding ramp that opens on lap 2. This unfortunately kind of ruins the track a little bit for me as you end up spending half the track on this boring downward slope. Still, the theming of this track is amazing and the music sounds straight out of a Christmas movie. Number 35, Tour Los Angeles Laps. This track is unique compared to the other cities in that it's section based, meaning each lap has a different starting line. This is probably one of the more controversial city tracks, particularly because of the changes made in this version, such as the track being set at midday instead of the afternoon, and the vocals being removed from the music. To be honest, these things don't really bother me too much. I actually think the music is far better in this version, though I do kinda wish they kept the... As for the track itself, the first 2 laps are pretty good with you driving through a beach and over a stadium. However, I'm not a huge fan of the 3rd lap. I don't know who thought an oil field would be a good idea to include. Like, were there really no other landmarks they could have included? What about something like Hollywood Hills? It'd be so cool to drive past the Hollywood sign. But alas. And with that, onto the B tier, with tracks that are pretty decent. Not my favourites, but pretty good. Number 34, GBA Boo Lake. Oh my god, they actually added a lake. The track name makes sense now. Not only that, but you can drive in said lake too. And it even has anti-gravity. And the music slaps, which is amazing considering it's based on the SNES Ghost Valley music, which barely even counts as music at all. However, this track is this low for a reason, and it's because I just find it to be a little too short. The actual track layout and overall theming also isn't super interesting. Like, other than the lake, there's really nothing that separates this from the other Ghost tracks we've gotten in past games. Number 33, Tour Berlin Byways. Speaking of music that slaps, Berlin Byways has probably one of the best music tracks in any Mario Kart game. They somehow managed to combine electronic and orchestral music and it sounds amazing. Oh yeah, the track's alright as well. Unlike the other city tracks, this one actually has traffic, which I think most of them would have, but nope, it's just this one. I quite like the addition of Wumps in lap 3, and I don't know why, but the imagery of the Berlin Wall being covered in Mario artwork and being partially made up of Wumps is really funny to me. That being said, the rest of the track is pretty uninteresting. The actual layout is fine, but this track looks pretty bland compared to some of the other cities. Lap 2 is also pretty uninteresting, with it not really having any unique set pieces like the train in lap 1 and the Berlin Wall in lap 3. Honestly, if it wasn't for the music being so good, this track probably would have been ranked lower. Number 32, N64 Choco Mountain. I gotta say, Mario Kart 64 was done real dirty in this DLC. Only 2 tracks? Really? I mean, they're 2 of the most iconic tracks from the game, yes, but come on. You could have gotten the first ever remake of Wario Stadium. Oh well. At least the N64 track's got a pretty big glow up. In Choco Mountain's case, that one tunnel from the original has been turned into a whole cave section, complete with crystals and bats. They also added a glider ramp directly after this section, which is a nice touch. They did remove the ability to fall onto a previous section of the track, which some people might not like, but I don't have much of a problem with that. I do wish the boulders were a bit harder to avoid though. I feel like I've never once gotten hit by one. Another issue I have with this remake is the music. Perhaps this is an unpopular opinion, but I'm not a huge fan of the remix this track got. I honestly don't know why, but I just prefer the original music. Number 31, N64 Calamari Desert. The final N64 track in this DLC. Like I said, they really should have added more than 2. But anyway, I think Calamari Desert got an even bigger glow up than Choco Mountain. The main reason is because, like with the tour tracks, the route actually changes each lap. On lap 2 you drive along the train tracks, and in lap 3 you drive through the tunnel, which is really cool. Especially considering I was never a huge fan of this track in the original, I always thought it was a bit bland. I'm not a huge fan of the aesthetic, desert tracks have always been a bit boring to me, and the overall layout of the track is still quite simple. The music's nice though. Number 30, GBA Snowland. After the poor remake of Skygon and in Wave 1, Getting this track in Wave 2 almost seemed like an apology for that track, as it's a much better remake. The thing I like most about this track, other than the fact that the screen isn't constantly shaking now, is strangely enough the background. The pink sky combined with the blue and pink crystals just looks great. The track itself, while a little generic, is pretty fun honestly. And that's coming from someone who doesn't really like ice levels in games, especially Mario Kart. There's some penguins to avoid halfway through the track, a few good shortcuts, and the item boxes actually move along the track. The music is fittingly cheery and even has a new intro, but has anyone ever noticed how similar it is to Choco Mountain's music? Weird. Number 29, GBA Riverside Park. One of the most gorgeous tracks in the entire BCP. This almost looks on the level of base Mario Kart 8. As for the track itself, while it is relatively simple like the other GBA tracks, it does have some interesting elements. The biggest being the Patuis, who you can hit with items to drop mushrooms. This is a really cool mechanic, even if I never use it when playing the track. There's also a big jump through a waterfall at the end, which looks really cool. Overall, this is a very solid track with a great theme, even if the music is slightly forgettable. Number 28, Wii Moonview Highway. One of the most surprising track reveals in the whole pass. Moonview Highway is both better and worse than the original. I think the visuals are vastly improved from the Wii original, especially the beginning section with the blue lighting and the moon reflecting off a lake. It looks amazing. I'm not a super huge fan of how the city part looks, as I think it looks a bit too similar to New York Minute, but it's fine. As for how the track is worse, they made the cars much slower than the original and there aren't nearly as many of them. They also don't speed up in the city section anymore, which is a bit of a letdown, but hey, at least the new music is incredible. Number 27, Tour Sydney Sprint. This was a track that for many people showed that the city tracks could actually be fun. While I definitely don't think it's the best city track, it's still pretty enjoyable. You drive through the Opera House with the distracting GIF-looking crowd that the DLC tracks seem to love using, through Luna Park, which makes me realise how cool an entire theme park track would be, and you even drive through a ferry in lap 2. I also like how when you cross the Sydney Harbour Bridge in lap 1, there's some big metal structure in the middle that you have to dodge, and then in laps 2 and 3 it's revealed that those are actually ramps and you can now drive on them. Lap 3 is admittedly a bit boring as it's mostly just lap 1 in reverse, but overall this is a pretty good track. The music is also really good, if a bit repetitive. Number 26, Tour Amsterdam Drift. Out of all the city tracks, this is the one I feel like people talk about the least. Like for most of the city tracks I know what the general opinion on them is, but Amsterdam Drift? I have no idea. Well, I personally think this track is pretty good. I especially like how varied it is. You start by gliding over train tracks into the Zans... I can't be bothered to try and pronounce that. And after passing some windmills and Monty Moles, you return to the city for lap 2. Lap 2 sees you go into the only required underwater section in any of the city tracks. Driving at the bottom of a canal is actually kinda cool, and you can even trick off a boat. And in lap 3 you take a huge U-turn, making this the second city track to let you bump into other racers going in the opposite direction, before going underwater again and eventually making it to a tulip field. I love how colourful this part is, even if the tulips themselves are pretty low poly. Unfortunately, other than the tulip field and windmills, this track doesn't look all that interesting visually, but at least the music's nice. Number 25, Tour Vancouver Velocity. I still think it's weird that this track was released in Wave 5 and not 6. I don't know, but it just seems a little strange to release a winter themed track in the summer. But then again, Snowland was released in August 2022, so I guess it doesn't matter too much. But as for the track itself, I was honestly slightly disappointed. Don't get me wrong, it's still a solid track, but the third lap in particular definitely dragged it down a little. The rest of the track is good though. The first lap even features the only anti-gravity section in the city track, being the Capilano suspension bridge. In lap 2 you drive through a park area before entering the Rogers Arena, complete with these adorable ice skating Shy Guys. Like I mentioned before, the third lap is pretty underwhelming, with you driving through the Massey Tunnel and a small shopping area, neither of which are very interesting, and then back through the Rogers Arena and that's it. While I was disappointed with the third lap, I was not disappointed with the visuals and music. This is one of the best looking and sounding city tracks in my opinion. Number 24, Tour Bangkok Rush. Originally I was going to place this track lower, but after playing it again I realised it's actually one of the better city tracks. While the Skybox is a definite downgrade from Tour and I'm not a huge fan of the music, I think the actual track layout is quite good. You start lap 1 by driving through the Chao Phraya River, which is strangely not an underwater section, but hey, at least it means you can trick off the boats. You can then choose to either drive on the BTS SkyTrain rails or below them. Unfortunately, they did remove the inky piranha plants from Tour, which is a little sad, but not a huge deal honestly. In lap 2 you take what is honestly one of the coolest glider ramps in the whole game. There's even fireworks in the background. In lap 3 you drive up the ramps of a multi-story car park, which is admittedly quite boring visually, but it makes up for it with you being able to bounce onto like rock fighters, which makes no sense, but damn it is fun. And that's the end of the track. Overall, another solid city track. And now we go on to the A tier tracks, which are tracks that are really good, but not quite the best. Number 23, Tour Roma Vanti. Okay, I know this is the 5th city track in a row, but I promise the next 5 tracks are not city tracks. As for Roma Vanti, this is definitely the best looking city track in my opinion. The cloudy night sky combined with how detailed everything is, made this an absolutely gorgeous track. However, I was a little disappointed with the layout. For the penultimate city track, I was honestly expecting it to be a little more interesting. The first lap has you driving up the side of the Colosseum and eventually past some rocky wrenches, which is cool, but the second lap is unfortunately pretty uninteresting. Other than being able to run into other drivers, like in Paris Promenade and Amsterdam Drift, the only interesting part of this lap is that you drive up a large staircase into a park area, and even then that's not that interesting. Thankfully the third lap makes up for this somewhat by having you first glide over a weirdly nice looking bit of water, then driving through the Colosseum again, but this time avoiding chain chomps. Towards the end, you can glide past some fuzzies, which is pretty neat. Not much else to say, really. Number 22, DS Shroom Ridge. Having never played Mario Kart DS, I have no idea what to expect with this track. To me, it just looked like a worse version of Toad's Turnpike. However, after playing it, I found it to be a lot more fun than I thought it would be. While visually it's only slightly above Toad Circuit in my opinion, I think this is honestly the best traffic course in the game. The main reason being that it's not just completely flat and the cars are actually somewhat difficult to avoid. It's very satisfying to drift through the entire tunnel without hitting the cars or the wall, and I really like the added shortcut at the end. However, I do think the glide round was a bit unnecessary as you don't really end up gliding very far. The music is also one of my favourite remixes in the DLC. Number 21, 3DS Rosalina's Ice World. Until the Wave 6 trailer dropped, I had no idea that people hated this track so much. I always thought it was a pretty good track, even if I wish they went further with the Mario Galaxy theming. And I think this is honestly a great update to this track. They added some half pipes to the section just before the ice, which makes it not only the only 3DS track to have half pipes, but it also makes it easier to get on the ice in lap 3. I also like the new mushroom shortcut at the end. And visually it looks absolutely stunning, with the skybox in particular being incredibly vibrant. I also like the music, but I wish it, like the track itself, leaned more into the Galaxy theming. Overall, while I might be slightly biased because Galaxy is my favourite Mario game, I still think this track is great and pretty underrated. Number 20, GCN Daisy Cruiser. I said before that Mario Kart 64 was done dirty by only having 2 tracks, but I think it was absolutely criminal to only give Double Dash 3 tracks. That game has some of the most iconic and memorable tracks in the entire series, and it sucks we didn't get more of them. But the 3 they chose were very good choices. Case in point, Daisy Cruiser. One of the most unique tracks in all of Mario Kart, this track takes you all over a cruise ship. You could drive through a pool which now has Goombas floating in it, through a dining area where you have to dodge tables moving around which now have people sat at them, which can't be fun for them. And you can even choose to go underwater, which is kind of worrying if you think about it. Like, why is there a whole section of the ship submerged in water? Oh well, at least you get a double item box from it. Overall, this track is as fun as it always was. Number 19, DS Peach Gardens. This is one of my favourite retro tracks in Wii, and I think the version here is pretty great as well. I especially like how the hedges are shaped like different characters. We already had the Mario hedge at the start in the original, but now we also have Peach and Luigi hedges as well. I will say I'm not a huge fan of the grass sections being simplified, but honestly the third lap more than makes up for it by making you go in reverse. This might not seem cool, but you get to glide over all the hedges in one section. And any track that lets you high-five Luigi is a good one in my opinion. Number 18, GCN DK Mountain. This might be controversial, but I was never the biggest fan of this track. I didn't like it much in Wii, and I don't remember how it was in Double Dash, but since I don't like how that game controls, I assume it wasn't very fun. However, I think this version of the track is actually really good. It's probably because I prefer the controls of 8 over Wii and Double Dash, but I also think they made some great improvements to this track. For starters, I love how the mountain looks here. Before, the face just looked like it was drawn on, but now not only is it carved into the mountain, but it also glows red from the lava, making it look much more menacing. I also like how the ramps are now built into the mountain. I was never a fan of how the Wii version just put wooden ramps there, it felt very out of place. Another change worth mentioning is that the bridge now shakes a lot more, meaning you can now perform tricks on it, which is pretty cool. Overall, while I wasn't a fan of this track before, I definitely am now. Number 17, Tour Madrid Drive. Just like with DK Mountain, I also wasn't expecting to like this track that much. I played it in Tour when it first came out and wasn't really impressed. However, I was pleasantly surprised by just how fun this course actually is. While there are a few typical boring road sections, these are even out with some of the most unique and interesting locations of all the city tracks. I especially like how each of these locations has a different Mario enemy inside them. The Plaza Mayor has a Wiggler, the Madrid Atocha Station and Prado Museum have piranha plants, the Market of San Miguel has thwomps, and the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium has shoe goombas, the latter being my favourite part of the track. The music is also amazing and definitely one of the best city track themes. Number 16, Wii Koopa Cave. Koopa Cave was always my favourite track in Mario Kart Wii, which is why it really hurts whenever they remake it, as it just seems to get butchered more and more each time. 7 made the pipe section more boring by making it an underwater section, replacing the Koopa Zappers with Cheep Cheeps, and added a pointless glider ramp at the start of the river section. Tor ruined the track even more by making the aesthetic much more generic and ugly, although the addition of a half pipe in the pipe section was kinda cool. How does the 8 version stack up? Well, thankfully it's at least on par with 7's version in my opinion. Yes, it keeps the same ugly aesthetic as Tor, but it removes that pointless glider ramp and makes the pipe section anti-gravity. They did remove the Cheep Cheeps, but I'm not super bothered by that. I think my favourite change, however, is that they brought back the river section's unique music that was absent in 7 and Tor. Overall, while I consider this to be inferior to the original version, at the end of the day it's still Koopa Cave, so it's still a fun time. Number 15, Tor Singapore Speedway. Wow, in terms of art direction I'd say this is definitely the best of the city tracks. I love how vibrant everything is, with all the bright lights and that rainbowy water. It just looks great. As for the track itself, it's a lot of fun. You start by entering this neon cannon and blasting off onto the roof of Marina Bay Sands, before gliding back down over the float at Marina Bay. The second lap then takes you through Chinatown, which even has its own version of the music. You then glide over to some conveyor belts, which starts lap 3. You then enter another gliding section, then drive through Chinatown again and the race is done. There's just so much that happens in this course, and the excellent visuals and music solidify it as one of the best city tracks. Number 14, Tor Athens Dash. In my opinion, this is the best Tor city track in the game. It just feels so unique compared to the other city tracks. Instead of driving along typical grey roads surrounded by large buildings, Athens Dash has you driving through and even on ancient ruins. Each lap is a ton of fun. Lap 1 has you driving on the Theatre of Dionysus before taking a glider ramp towards a half-pipe. Lap 2 then has you jumping all the way back down towards the theatre, which is really cool, and then driving up some stairs with a shortcut in the middle. In lap 3 you glide past some houses, then do a hill climb whilst avoiding falling rocks. While not the best track visually, I just have so much fun playing this track and the music is absolutely incredible. It gives this track a very epic feel. Number 13, Wii DK Snowboard Cross. First of all, can we all agree that DK Snowboard Cross is a far better name than DK Summit? DK Summit sounds like it could be interchangeable with DK Mountain in my opinion. But anyway, this was another great track from Wii, and I think it translates mostly well to 8 Deluxe. Firstly, I like how the Mario statue was replaced with a Donkey Kong statue, which makes more sense considering the name of the track. I also like how the double cut was retained, especially considering Mario Kart 8's rather strict out of bounds detection compared to a game like Mario Kart Wii. I will say, this track makes it very obvious that this game was not made with half-pipes in mind, as using the half-pipes can lead to some janky moments. However, that just makes this track more fun to me. Number 12, GCN Waluigi Stadium. Like with DK Mountain, this was a track I wasn't a huge fan of originally. However, I really enjoyed it in this game, and I think this is a really good remake. For starters, it looks absolutely amazing, almost on the level of Base 8. They also added some new anti-gravity sections which aren't super crazy, but they're a nice addition. I also like how they kept the half-pipes from the Wii version. There's not too much else to say about this track other than it's a really great update to an already iconic track. Number 11, Wii Mushroom Gorge. Another one of my favourite tracks from Wii. I honestly think this is the best version of this track we've ever gotten. It seems to combine all the best elements of each previous version. The improved aesthetic from Tor, the glide mushroom from 7, and the mushroom layout in the cave and shortcuts from Wii. It still surprises me they actually allow you to do the gap jump in this version. This track really is just as fun as it always was, and while I'm admittedly a little disappointed that the music didn't get a full remix, that hardly matters when they got the track itself pretty much perfect. Number 10, Wee Coconut Mall. I know some people are probably going to be shocked that this track isn't in the top 5. After all, this is a fan favourite and considered by many to be one of, if not the best track in the whole series. Hell, this was my second favourite track in Mario Kart Wii behind Cooper Cape. So why is it only number 10? Well, as with Cooper Cape, they made some questionable changes to this track. Nothing that outright ruins it, of course, but I'd still consider this a downgrade from the original. I think the main issue for me is that it loses a lot of the realism the original had with the brighter colours and conveyors instead of escalators. The main appeal of Coconut Mall, at least for me, was that it almost felt like you were driving through a real shopping centre, but with this version I don't really get that feeling. All that being said, this track is still a blast even with these changes. The layout is still great and all the same obstacles and set pieces are here. I don't actually mind what they did with the cars, after the update anyway, even if they are slightly easier to dodge. And of course the music is just as great as ever. While I may be slightly disappointed with this remake, it's still Coconut Mall and I still really enjoy racing on it. Alright, now we are getting on to the best of the Booster Calls Pass. It's the S tier, starting with number 9, SNES Bowser Castle 3. But really, what was I expecting? I mean, how do you make a SNES track interesting? Oh my god, they did it! They made a SNES track interesting. Not only that, it's good. Great even. The visuals are absolutely breathtaking. This is definitely my favourite looking track in the entire DLC. And the way they adapted the track from the SNES is so creative. They basically did what they did for GBA Mario Circuit in the base game, and tilted a large section of the track and gave it anti-gravity. Of course the track's staple split paths are still here. In the section where there's 3 lanes divided by walls, not only do the lanes now have ramps and boost pads, you can now drive on the walls to get items. It's quite tricky to do, especially in 200cc, but when you manage to drive across the whole walls, it's so satisfying. And at the end, you jump past 2 thwomps, and if you time it right, you can land on one of them and get a coin. Yes, in this track, you can literally stomp on the thwomp, and the music, oh. You remember that Fortune Street remix of Super Mario World's final boss theme? Well, imagine that, but it somehow goes even harder. Now you might be wondering why this track is only number 9. Well, that's because as cool as this remake is, it is still a remake of a SNES track, so it's quite short and the layout isn't super interesting. Still, this is one of the most ambitious remakes of any track I've ever seen, and it absolutely deserves to be in the top 10. Number 8, DS Waluigi Pinball. You all knew this was going to be in the top 10. Waluigi Pinball is a certified classic and a favourite of many. And the track is basically unchanged here, which is great, but also the reason why this is only number 8. I just think they could have done a little bit more to this track. Like, a good portion of this track feels like it really could have been an anti-gravity section. Also, replaying this track made me realise that the actual layout isn't that interesting. There are literally no shortcuts on this entire track, which isn't a huge deal for me. I personally think Mario Kart tracks don't need shortcuts to be good, but I would rather have at least one than none at all. I also really wish they gave this track its own remix instead of just using the Wario Stadium music. Again, not a huge deal, but still a little disappointing. I will say that I really like how this track looks now. While I may miss the giant creepy Waluigi statue, this remake is just so vibrant and detailed that I think it looks better overall. And of course, the whole pinball gimmick is still really creative and fun. Overall, while this remake definitely could have been better, it's still a fantastic track that is definitely worthy of its fan favourite status. Number 7, Yoshi's Island. Probably the most unanimously liked original track of the Booster Calls Pass, and it's not hard to see why. They went all out with the theming here. Visually it looks exactly like how Yoshi's Island would look if it was a 3D game. You start by driving through Yoshi's house, there's still guys and huffing puffins to avoid, you can glide into a winged cloud to spot a red bridge, and if you drive across the whole bridge, you can even jump through a gold ring. There's also a lot of smaller details, like the coins being replaced with Yoshi coins, but by far my favourite thing about this track are the custom start, finish and results jingles they added that are taken from the original Yoshi's Island. It's so cool that they actually went the extra mile to include things like this. I do think the layout is a tad basic, and I've not actually played too much of Yoshi's Island, so I don't really get some of the references, but those are really just minor nitpicks. Number 6, Piranha Plant Cove. Before I get into this track, I think we should have a moment of silence for Piranha Plant Pipeline, the only Torn Nitro track not to get in the BCP. But honestly, if we could only get one of the Piranha Plant tracks, I definitely would have preferred Cove, and I'm glad that's what we got. Unlike every other Tour Nitro, this track actually changes every lap, just like the city tracks. I really hope this whole lap changing gimmick becomes a series mainstay. I like how varied tracks end up feeling. I honestly wasn't expecting to like this track that much, as I'm not a huge fan of underwater tracks in this game, despite Dolphin Shoals apparently being my favourite course, but I actually really like how the water mechanics were utilised here. There's a few moments where you jump into the water and float slowly down. While this can be a bit boring, you can actually move while sinking, allowing you to take shortcuts if you angle yourself correctly. I think my favourite part of this track has to be the visuals. Underwater ruins are so cool to me, and this track is no exception. I especially like all of the Petey Piranha references, which makes me wonder if maybe Petey is some kind of ancient god. But yeah, this track is awesome and has some pretty great music as well. Number 5, Wii Maple Treeway. Yet another one of my favourite tracks from Wii. Yeah, there's a lot of Wii tracks in this DLC. Maple Treeway received a pretty great remake overall. Sure, they removed the iconic Jack-Off bridge, but everything else is just as good as it always was. The wigglers, the leaf piles that sometimes drop mushrooms, the cannon, the half-pipe, which was the first of the entirety of Mario Kart 8, are all here and accounted for. Visually, this track looks so good. It's so much more vibrant than the original, and the tree branches that you drive on are surprisingly detailed, and the music is somehow even more soothing than it was before. There's not much else to say, this is a great remake of a great track. Number 4, Ninja Hideaway. Probably one of the most divisive tracks in the entire game. It seems people either love this track or hate it. Well, I could definitely see why people would dislike this track. I've always thought it's one of the most creative and fun tracks in the game. There's so many different paths to take, there's only a couple times where everyone will be on the same path. And each path has its own unique obstacles. The top paths have these ninja shy guys that appear and disappear at random, leaving behind bananas. And these rising and falling platforms that can only lead you to the rest of the top path if you time it right. On the other hand, the bottom path has these spikes attached to the bottom of those moving platforms that you need to avoid. However, there's also a shortcut you can take at that section. I just love how many options you have here. And visually, while it's not the most detailed track in the DLC, I really like how colourful it is, despite it being a track set in the evening. And the music absolutely slaps, definitely one of my favourite songs in this game. Number 3, Squeaky Clean Sprint. I'm not sure who at Nintendo came up with the idea to make a bathroom themed track, but whoever it was, they deserve a raise because this is one of the coolest tracks I've ever played in a Mario Kart game. It genuinely feels like you're driving through someone's bathroom. You'll drive through a sink, then jump into a bath, then fall down a plug hole and finally fly over a toilet. The toilet actually sprays water in laps 2 and 3, which is gross, but it allows you to get up to a higher path, which is cool. There's so many other cool details about this track, like how you can drive on sponges, trick off of dissolving bath bombs, and there's even the binding band from Odyssey in the drain. Also, I like to think that the bathroom this track takes place in is in the same house as the bedroom that Ribbon Road takes place in. Maybe one day we'll also get a kitchen track or a living room track, although I guess we kind of have that already. Overall, this is an incredibly fun track with an amazingly goofy theme. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll have likely realised that the final 2 tracks left are both the Rainbow Roads included in the BCP. Yeah, who could have seen that coming? But which of these is number 1? And which just barely missed out? Well, I can reveal that the number 2 best track in the BCP is 3DS Rainbow Road. For the longest time, I considered Mario Kart 7's rendition of Rainbow Road to be the best in the whole series. Granted, I've never played Double Dash or DS's Rainbow Roads, but I doubt I would prefer them to 7's anyway. However, after replaying this track as well as the number 1 track, both the original and the BCP version, I no longer think this is the best Rainbow Road. It is a very close second though. What this track has over the other Rainbow Roads is a sheer variety of things going on. It has the typical Rainbow Road elements such as the Rainbow Road itself, but mixes things up by having you drive on Saturn's ring, avoiding change jumps on the moon, and driving through a rotating tunnel with a glider section at the end. As for this remake, the visuals are really the only major change, and I think it looks pretty good. There are some rough areas like the moon looks a bit too dark, and while I love the liquidy texture of the road, I think it looks a bit too blue honestly. But overall, it looks quite nice. Apparently they did remove some shortcuts, but to be honest, that doesn't really bother me much as I didn't even know those shortcuts existed. I do think the music is a slight downgrade from the original. It's not bad at all, but I feel like it loses a bit of the magical feeling the original had. Now, the reason why I don't think this is the best Rainbow Road anymore, I just think it's a little too easy for a Rainbow Road. Don't get me wrong, it's far from the easiest course in the game, hell, it's not even the easiest Rainbow Road in the series, and it's still a ton of fun to race on, but it definitely feels a bit more relaxed than some other Rainbow Roads. Still, this is an amazing track, even if it just missed out on the top spot. And finally, the number 1 best track in the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. There's no point doing a dramatic build-up. You already know what it is. Number 1, Wii Rainbow Road. The greatest Rainbow Road, not even just in Mario Kart 8, but the entire series. I know some will probably disagree with this, but I don't care. This track is just that good. It's challenging, has a lot of cool moments like the big star tunnel and that one half-pipe jump, and has references to Mario Galaxy, which is always a good thing. And this remake is just as great as the original. I was very worried that since all the tracks in this DLC are ported from Tour, that this track would retain the awful changes they made in Tour, but thankfully that's not the case. The pastel colours are back, the ramps around these giant holes are back, and they even brought back the fire effect when falling off. Like, how cool is that? I still say the original looks slightly better, as I think they made the tile effect a bit too prominent here, and I wish they got rid of some of the railings added in Tour, but overall they did a really good job here. The music is also just as beautiful as it always was, and I still love how they incorporated the good Galaxy motif into it. Overall, this is one of the best tracks in the entire series, and a phenomenal way to end off the Booster Calls Pass. So that's my ranking of every track in the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Calls Pass. I know some people will definitely disagree with me, so feel free to comment where you would rank each track. But with that, remember to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and thank you for watching.